Almost ready. It's that little bar moving slowly across the screen. Come on. There we go. Okay, and let me get back to my major screen. You know what? I think we can go one bigger on that. There we go. All right. Well, that's our normal 1 minute intro and of me clicking things. Let me first of all say thank you all for coming back this week. I know last week, abruptly after Chag, we didn't have class because of the funeral that was needed following that holiday. Uh, Appreciate everybody's patience and understanding that sometimes life cycles will interrupt our regularly scheduled things, and obviously they demand our first attention and priority. So with that in mind, let us get down to our Torah portion today, which is, well, a big one. I know they all are, but Kedoshim is one that is often quoted and often referred to in many different contexts, and one that we will look at the beginning of today, but then look at one of the more fundamental aspects of it. So let's go ahead and take a look here. We're in chapter 19. Oftentimes this area is called the Holiness Code or some other different terminologies that's used. I think you'll understand why as we dive in, although despite the word Kedoshim meaning holy, and despite the fact that that comes at the beginning of the parasha, hence its name, the word holy itself does not show up very much in the Torah portion. Let's see if we can't figure that out. So here we are, chapter 1. Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the entire community of the children of Israel and say to them, Holy are you to be, for holy am I, Adonai, your God." Again, as is Fox's style, he is trying to capture the word order as best as possible that comes from the Hebrew into English. A reminder, of course, that English and Hebrew are different languages, and that means that a literal Hebrew, either in word definition or in word order, is not going to necessarily capture the meaning of the Hebrew, but here I think it does capture some of the poetry. You will be holy, for I am holy, is really trying to put a very difficult concept into our minds. There is a superficial way to understand that, which is to say that God is holy, and therefore the people that follow God automatically become holy. However, that really trivializes and fails to take into consideration the rest of the context of this chapter. If that was just a standalone verse floating in the ether, perhaps that could be the meaning that since we follow God, since we are his community, then we automatically become holy because God's holiness rubs off on us. However, that does not seem to be what this chapter is trying to teach us. Instead, it is trying to give a command. That is to say, we will be holy. One should strive to be holy because of God's holiness. And we are then going to launch into a list of ways in which one can strive to be holy. Now, before we get into that list and all of its practical implications, let's just understand for a moment the spiritual audacity that is being stated here. It is trying to, one, describe holiness as a quality which is attainable by human beings. That holiness is not a property that is only found in the heavenly realms, in the world beyond this world, not only within the connection to the pure, unadulterated existence of God, as distinct from the messy, greasy material world, but that in fact holiness is achievable in this world, and that holiness should therefore be a goal of ourselves in this world. As we're going to see from the list that comes, holiness in that sense does not seem to come purely by following what might be considered in the modern terms the religious commandments. That is to say, the usage of the word holy in modern English, especially with reference to pop culture and common usage, really does tend to lend itself towards people that are dressed in white and are constantly praying and singing hymns to God, and very particular and careful about coming into contact with things that are profane or lacking in the proper sanctity. And while, well, apart from the white part, while all of that does play a role within Judaism and within the concept of holiness, as we're going to see, holiness in chapter 19 is really trying to direct us towards things that we do in that messy, greasy world. And that is where holiness is going to be found. Indeed, that is where sanctification is created. So let's get down to those examples, see how they shape up, and then we are going to have an extended look at what all of this is telling us, not just about us and our own role, but also what we can say then about God with this as our template. Each man, his mother and his father, you are to hold in awe. We have talked other times about this idea of yira, of holding something in trembling awe, in an awe that is overwhelming, making one feel in the presence of greatness, but also not terrified in the sense of imminent violent danger, but simply of being next to something that is too great to comprehend. And that concept is meant to be applied to our parents. Likewise, my Shabbats you are to keep. I am Adonai, your God. So very beautifully, God puts in the first verse here of this section, a nuts and bolts, bread and butter, greasy material world. How do you relate to your family, which can be one of the biggest challenges in most people's lives, alongside the more ethereal and spiritual and open world of Shabbat, which is often transcending this world, and trying to point out that indeed both of these are part of our track towards holiness. It is not that our worship of Shabbat is how we find holiness, and our parents, take a back seat. It's not that our parents or our material world is the most important thing, and the spirituality of Shabbat can take a back seat. They are existing side by side. We're going to see that reinforced throughout this chapter. Do not turn your faces to no gods, and molten gods you are not to make yourselves. I, Adonai, I am Adonai, your God. So again, although it's not apparent at the first read, we are seeing a both spiritual and material component in this verse. The spiritual is, of course, that we do not turn towards God, these other false gods. What this means is, of course, that we do not believe in them. The turning your face towards is a idiomatic expression in a biblical Hebrew of seeking favor and looking upon it something with joy or happiness or blessing. That is not the spiritual state we should have towards these false gods, towards idols, or indeed anything that is not actually Adonai. And then we get our physical component, which is, and don't make them. So not only should we not spiritually yearn for these fake gods, we also shouldn't be constructing them physically in this world either. Onwards, now when you sacrifice a sacrifice of shalom to Adonai, for your being accepted, you are to sacrifice. So we have this sacrificial service that we are doing here, the shlamim, and we see in verse 6 as it continues, at the time of your sacrificing, it is to be eaten, and on the morrow as well, meaning the day and the day after of the sacrifice. But what remains by the third day is to be burned in fire. We do not have extended leftovers within the biblical sacrificial service, and that was for a couple of reasons. One, since the sacrifice itself, the meat is considered holy, having been part of the altar process. If we were to allow it to be eaten for any extended period of time, then the likelihood dramatically increases that somebody who is ritually impure or who becomes ritually impure might take part in it, or might touch it and thus render it impure, which would also be a violation. by requiring it to be eaten earlier and faster, we are avoiding that. Second aspect, of course, is that by requiring it to all be eaten quickly, and since many sacrifices did not have, were too much for one person or even one family to eat in a short amount of time, this would also encourage you to invite additional friends, additional members of the religious community, specifically the Levites and Kohanim, who didn't have their own share of the produce, and of course the poor, to partake in this sacrifice. That way, this is encouraging sharing. As they say, you can't take it with you. Here in the short-term version, it means that you might as well share it, otherwise it's going to waste. And as it gets reinforced then at the end, should it be eaten? Yes, eaten on the third day, it is tainted meat. It will not be accepted. Those who eat it, his iniquity must he bear, for the holy offering of Adonai he has profaned. Cut off shall that person be from his kinspeople. This notion of karet, which we've talked about at other times, of spiritual excision. Now, that all sounds very holy, perhaps, even stereotypical. We're talking about sacrifices and the altar services and what is profane and what is not profane. Good, but as I mentioned, there is a material component there, not just the meat, but how we involve other people in that process. Verse number 9, on the other hand, is going to swing the other direction. Now, when you harvest the harvest of your land, you are not to finish to the edge of your field in harvesting. The full gathering of your harvest you are not to gather. What does this mean? Your vineyard you are not to glean. The break off of your vineyard you are not to gather. Rather, for the afflicted, poor is another translation, for the sojourner, meaning somebody that is not an actual citizen, but even just a traveler through, you are to leave them. I am Adonai, your God. So, moving from the altar to our daily work, and this would have been the daily work for most people, we find that as we harvest, we have to leave over. This is one of the many different ways that Judaism tries to bake tzedakah, bake justice, and what we might call charity in modern English into our very work from ground zero, not leaving it just until tithing or until goodwill towards others encourages you to open your hand, but that indeed, while you are harvesting, you have to leave the leftover. Things that fall accidentally are left behind, and those that are indigent can then collect them. We see the most famous example of this, of course, in the book of Ruth. Verse 11, you are not to steal, you are not to lie, you are not to deal falsely with each man with his fellow. You are not to swear by my name falsely, thus profaning the name of your God. I am Adonai. So again, we move to a more criminal type legislation, and that in refraining from theft and refraining from lying or dealing in bad faith with others, or indeed of making oaths that are reinforced by the use of God's name that we know to be false, all of those would be violations of holiness. And that by making sure we don't do those things, we are ensuring that our lives become more holy. So we've seen now both ritual, we've seen things that are civil and how we help those in need, and we're seeing things that deal with the criminal process. And of course, we dealt with the personal observance of Shabbat and the personal observance of respect for our parents. This is a huge range of different emotions and practices that are being reinforced here in chapter 19. You are not to withhold property from your neighbor. You are not to commit robbery. You are not to keep overnight the working wages of a hired hand with you until morning. So again, we are given both civil and criminal legislation here. One that we are not allowed to take, and both theft and robbery are two different types of depriving another person of property. And we also see that there is a way to deprive someone of property even without the normal acts of stealth or violence, but instead simply by not paying a person in a timely manner. That if somebody is a hired hand, you have to pay them at the time of their compensation. Normally, that would have been that you would pay them at the end of the day. And even waiting until the next morning would be inadequate and would be a violation. Perhaps they need that money to buy food that very day. After all, the people who would hire themselves out on a day-by-day basis were often people that were in the most dire circumstances. So keeping the food overnight is a form of theft, and it is a form of abuse of another person. Speaking of abuse, we turn to verse 14. You are not to insult the deaf. Before the blind, you are not to place a stumbling block. Rather, you are to hold your God in awe. I am Adonai. So there's so much to be said, and we have talked about these verses in the past, but just a short summary, of course. Not insulting the deaf is teaching us not only that we don't insult people, which we might have thought was automatic, but that even one who is not directly harmed, being deaf and thus not knowing about the insult that we have uttered, even such a one we should not insult. That the insult that we give is not punishable purely because of the damage that it does, but because of the intent, because of the action behind it. So even if a person was completely oblivious to the insult that was uttered, for example, in this case, if they were deaf or never found out that we did it, we would still be liable before Adonai, which is why that is mentioned at the end of this verse. Likewise, a stumbling block before the blind. Here, yes, there may be a person actually injured, but certainly they don't know who committed the injury against them. Nonetheless, we should be respectful of God and hold God in awe, which means even if we think we can get away with something, we have to recognize that in fact, we are not getting away with something. I know too many people use the phrase, it's not illegal if you don't get caught. And while that may be true with regards to a human judicial system, there is no such thing as a perfect crime when you are talking about the judicial system of God, that we are held accountable even for things that the earthly court cannot convict us of. Continuing with that concept of justice, verse 15, you are not to commit corruption and injustice. You are not to lift up and favor the face of the poor, and you are not to overly honor the face of the great. With equity, you are to judge your fellow. Again, we might be tempted to somewhat tilt the scales of justice in favor of the poor, and that is a worthy sentiment, but it is the wrong application. If somebody is poor, we do not fix them through the judicial system. We make them whole through our tzedakah and our performance of all of the other legislation, such as the leaving of the field that we talked about earlier. That is how we help them. If they come to us and say, I own this cow, and their wealthy neighbor says, no, I own this cow. If the evidence proves that the wealthy neighbor owns it, we give the cow to the wealthy neighbor. We don't give it to the poor man, even though he needs it more. We can give from our own pocket. We can give in all the other ways the Torah commands us, but we don't change justice to help somebody in need any more than we would change justice to honor somebody that was perhaps rightly deserving of honor. If our noblest member of the community comes before the court with a civil claim, and it turns out they are wrong, and the person that opposes them is not really a very nice person, nonetheless, the justice has to take its course, and somebody that's not nice against somebody that is great, if the not nice person has the better claim, then the justice will incline towards them. That's perfectly normal and right, and to do otherwise would be to ruin the concept of tzedek in general, the concept of justice. There are many other ways to help the poor and honor the great without distorting justice. Verse 16, you are not to traffic in slander among your kinspeople. You are not to stand by the blood of your neighbor. I am Adonai. Onward, you are not to hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke, yes, rebuke your fellow, that you not bear sin because of him. So this is a very complicated one, and again, one that we've had other classes dealing with in much more detail. But we understand from it that we must give rebuke. Tochacha is very hard to do correctly, because oftentimes we go overboard or underboard, or do not speak up when we should. But When we do so, we must make sure that we are not hating the person as we rebuke them. That when we point out somebody's mistake and we try to help them correct it, we do it from a place of love and understanding, not a place of anger, which is why verse 18 continues with that theme. You are not to take vengeance. You are not to retain anger against the sons of your kinspeople, but be loving to your neighbor as one like yourself. I am Adonai. So, Ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, one of the more famous lines from the entire Torah, indeed often held up as being one of the centerpieces of Torah. You will love your fellow as yourself. This concept, of course, is inspiring and has inspired great acts of kindness throughout all of our history. We're going to stop there from our summary of chapter 19, because while there is much more to say, there is a topic that we need to look into in more depth. And if we don't do it now, we'll run out of time. We might still run out of time. It depends how fast we go. So chapter 19, from the beginning, has been saying that all of this is because God is holy, and thus we will be holy. And that concept is still one that perhaps we are wrestling with. I mean, is it saying that these are things God does? Are we doing it because these are the things that we are imitating of God? Are these the emotions of God? Is this the way of God? What do we mean by that when we say that because God is holy, we will be holy through the performance of these various commandments, or indeed all of the commandments? There is a possibility that we might play our connection with God, thinking that we are becoming more God-like in the process of these commandments. On the other hand, we might underplay it. We might fail to recognize that we are indeed imitating God in some way through the performance of these mitzvot. It is enough to leave anybody very confused, or dare I say, perplexed, which is why we are going to turn to Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed. Now, this is one of my favorite books of all time. It's very popular for many people, but I do need to give a little bit of introduction and explanation. While I might bring a few pieces from time to time from Moreh Nevuchim, I try to limit it because if you are not already confused, this will often make you confused, and I don't find that always very helpful. However, the topics that I feel there is more universal confusion about, I feel a little safer bringing larger chunks of it. Now, obviously, it is always best to study this in person, where it's possible to ask questions and to wrestle with the meaning in a way that has more give and take. We may not be in person, but I will keep my eye on the chat. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type them. If you're on the Zoom call, please feel free to raise your hand and unmute and actually make yourself heard. That's perfectly fine. This is not easy material by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it has some very important concepts within it about God and about how we behave. So for that, with hopefully a little bit of trepidation, we will dive in and see what we can learn. So here we are in part 1, chapter 54. The wisest man, our teacher Moses, asked 2 things of God and received a reply respecting both. This is going to sound very familiar if you were at services during Chol HaMoed Pesach, because this section of the Torah is read during that time. The one thing he asked was that God should let him know his true essence. The other, which in fact he asked first, that God should let him know his attributes. Okay, so when you go back and you read through that text carefully, you'll recognize that there are 2 different layers to Moses's request. One of them is, as Rambam put, that he should know more of God, his attributes, but he also asked that he should know truly his deepest and most clear essence. So in answer to both of these petitions, God promised that he would let him know all his attributes and that these were nothing but his actions. He also told him that his true essence could not be perceived, and pointed out a method by which he could obtain the utmost knowledge of God possible for a man to acquire. So God basically explains, look, God's essence is not something that can be understood completely by a human being. However, I will try and help you understand to the furthest degree possible that a human could understand what my essence is. However, my characteristics, my attributes, those you can understand because you can see those in my actions. Now, it is from that we are going to focus on this notion of God's attributes as being reflected in God's actions, and whether we can understand that arrow of connection, that line of causality correctly. Because oftentimes we read the return incorrectly. That is to say, when we look at the action, we think we understand the attribute, but oftentimes we are mistaken. And that's where Rambam is trying to set us straight in this chapter. It is therefore clear that the ways which Moses wished to know and which God taught him are the actions emanating from God. Our sages call them midot, qualities, and speak of the 13 midot of God, which you can see more about in the Talmud. They use the term also in reference to man. As you can compare, there are 4 different midot among those who go to the house of learning. There are 4 different midot among those who give charity, both taken from Pirkei Avot. So what Rambam is trying to draw our attention to is that this concept of midah, a measure, a quality, midot in the plural, is used both to describe God as well as to describe human beings. And that comparison, that similar use of terminology is not accidental. Now, despite that, they do not mean to say that God really possesses midot, but that he performs actions similar to such of our actions as originate in certain qualities. For example, in certain physical or psychical dispositions, not that God really has really such dispositions. Okay, this is really the main sentence that you've got to understand, and which we're going to unpack and explain as we go through, and the implications. But if you can come away understanding this, then you are ahead of the game and will avoid the confusion which many people don't even realize that they are laboring under. Right. God does not actually have midot. We use the term midot. We use the term qualities, which are paralleled to the qualities of human beings, because should we see a human being exercise such an action, we would attribute them to those particular qualities. The examples will make this much clearer, but that doesn't mean that God himself has those actual qualities. Now, why is Rambam trying to make this so clear, and why did I think it important enough to bother you on this lovely Wednesday afternoon to make this clear? Well, because when we think of God as having attributes, of having these different qualities, when we think of God as being compassionate and merciful, as different elements of God's psyche, then what we have essentially done is divided God into pieces. And we have also made God now subject to the emotional whims that we are also familiar with. That doesn't really work when talking about God. That works talking about any human being, from the weakest and most meek person in the world to the greatest king that's ever lived. We all are subject to various personal psychological qualities that will push and pull us at different times and lead to different actions, and some positive, some negative. God is not subject to those types of pressures and pulls. God is. That is the whole concept of God. God is that which is, meaning that God is not constantly being guided by these different impulses and qualities. Even the positive ones, which we use as descriptors of God, we must understand that those are not actual descriptors of God, but are merely descriptors of the actions that God has taken in the world, which, if those same actions were done by a human being, we would call them merciful, compassionate, kind, etc. So it is a useful way for us to identify and understand the actions of God, but we must make sure we don't read too far up the line that these are actually parts of God. Because as soon as God has parts, God is no longer truly echad, no longer truly one. And obviously that is the path towards idolatry. So that's what Rambam's basic principle is. Now we're going to go ahead and dive into that in much more detail. Oops, I just noticed that it's not letting me see the comments from YouTube. And let me just go ahead and make sure that those are available. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and dive in now to some examples of all of this and the famous 13 attributes, 13 midot, which again, those of you that come to services regularly will easily recognize as the passage that begins, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum Vechanun, right? Okay, hopefully that triggered the memory and we all really understand what page we're on now. Okay, so let's get down to some examples. Although Moses was shown all his goodness, that is to say, all his works, only the 13 midot are mentioned, right? Which Rambam is trying to fill in the gap here. It says that he will see all his works, but really we only see the 13 midot, which doesn't really sound like all. Well, why that? Because they include those acts of God which refer to the creation and the government of mankind, and to know these acts was the principal object of the prayer of Moses. It may not have been clear to us, but it was clear to God that what Moses wanted to know was not just God's deeds, but he wanted to understand God's deeds with relationship to the governance of the people. What's the proof? As Rambam explains, this is shown by the conclusion of his prayer, that I may know you, that I may find grace in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. That is to say, the people whom I have to rule by certain acts in the performance of which I must be guided by your own acts in governing them. So Moses is looking to imitate God in the most direct and practical of meanings, which is to say, God rules the world. Well, Moses is in a position to be the ruler of the Jewish people. And Moses would like to do that right. And to do it right, he will be observing God and using God's style. It sounds almost trivial. God's manner of action in the world as that template. And God understands that. And thus, when the 13 midot are being uttered, they emphasize those attributes, those characteristics, which are most relevant for this particular goal. That is to say, of guiding and governing the people of Israel. Now, let's continue in Rambam. Whenever any one of his actions is perceived by us, we ascribe to God that emotion which is the source of the act when performed by ourselves, and call him by an epithet which is formed from the verb expressing that emotion. We see, for example, how well he provides for the life of the embryo of living beings, how he endows with certain faculties both the embryo itself and those who have to rear it after its birth, in order that it may be protected from death and destruction, guarded against all harm, and assisted in the performance of all that is required for its development. Similar acts, when performed by us, are due to a certain emotion and tenderness called mercy and pity. So, if a human being is raising a child, if a human being is taking care of another person that is in need, we say that they are acting mercifully. We are saying that they are showing pity. And pity in the classic biblical sense is not a negative emotion like it unfortunately gets used in modern English. It means to find somebody so pathetic that you have pathos for them, that you have a feeling of tenderness on their behalf. So God does all those things for us, but that does not mean God has those emotions. However, to describe what those things mean for us and what they mean for our considered behavior, we use the emotions and the emotional terms that correspond to those actions when performed by a person. So a person, when taking care of somebody, for example, a child, we might call them being merciful, because it is the emotion of mercy that will usually generate a person to behave mercifully towards someone else. So thus, when God is taking care of us, we say God is being merciful, because that way, when we can see God's care for us, it will inspire us to generate more mercy within ourselves so that we will act in a more merciful way towards someone else. It is a very effective tool. However, Rambam is warning us that we shouldn't read that in reverse, that when I do this, it's because I am feeling merciful. Therefore, when God does that, God too must be having an emotional state of mercifulness or mercy. That is not the case, because God does not have fluctuating emotional states. God is static and unchanging. Whatever we may write that seems to indicate God's changes of temperament and mood is there to remind us of how we should behave in some similar types of situations. It is not because we believe that there is an actual change in God. For if God is changing, then one of two things must have been true. Either God was flawed and now has changed to a more perfect state, or God was perfect and has now changed to a flawed state. Neither one of those sentences makes sense if we are going by a strict definition of God. However, both of those can make sense if we are trying to motivate better human behavior. And that's how the Torah will often speak as a way of encouraging our own behavior. Rambam is very strongly cautioning us to not get the wrong notion about God while using the Torah's language. More examples coming along. God is therefore said to be merciful, and we get some very clear examples of that. Like as a father is merciful to his children, so the Lord is merciful to them that fear him. And I will spare them, as a man spares his own son that serves him. Very clear language that makes it sound like God is acting out of mercy, the same way that the humans in each of these metaphors is acting out of mercy. However, as Rambam explains, such instances do not imply that God is influenced by a feeling of mercy, but that acts similar to those which a father performs for his son, out of pity, mercy, and real affection, emanate from God solely for the benefit of his pious men, meaning people, and are by no means the result of any impression or change. So this is because this is what it is that God is. God is that which acts mercifully towards those that have behaved in a certain way. Then there are real benefits, real consequences in the world of our actions, which, had they come from a human, we would call such benefits merciful. But of course, they don't come from a human, they come from God, and the term is useful only in inspiring our action in imitation of God to likewise be merciful when we are in a similar position, which, as you can see, we can read very strongly in these metaphors. That is to say, like as a father is merciful to his children, is not teaching us so much about God's emotional state, because God does not have emotional states, but it is teaching us about the emotional state we should be striving for when we are taking care of our children. So it is giving us advice about our life while trying to make a metaphorical connection to God and how God treats the human beings. So too, for sparing a child, obviously we would be well advised to do the same and imitate that type of behavior. Going on with Rambam. When we give something to a person who has no claim upon us, we perform an act of grace. For example, in the book of Judges, grant them graciously to us, or which God has graciously given, because God has dealt graciously with me. So we can see when humans act in a way where they give more than is needed, we call that grace. So too, we use the term grace when talking about God behaving towards us in a way which to us appears that we had not earned it, and thus we use the human term grace in order to label what God has done for us, not just because metaphorically it makes it easier for us to connect to God, but also because it then encourages us to behave graciously in all of our dealings. Because if God is acting in a way which, were human to do it, we would call it gracious, then we are being told that we should, as humans, strive to act in a way that would be called gracious. Okay, Rambam points out instances of this kind are numerous. God creates and guides beings who have no claim upon him to be created and guided by him, the ultimate act of grace. He is therefore called gracious. His actions towards mankind also include great calamities, which overtake individuals and bring death to them, or affect whole families and even entire regions, spread death, destroy generation after generation, and spare nothing whatsoever. Okay, so we have to recognize that not all of God's actions are kindness, merciful, pitiful, and gracious. Some of them feel pretty horrible when we, the humans, are on the receiving end of them, such as any of these catastrophes that were just listed. Hence, there occur inundations, earthquakes, destructive storms, and expeditions of one nation against the other for the sake of destroying it with the sword and blotting out its memory, war, and many other evils of the same kind. Whenever such evils are caused to us by us to, let me do the English. Whenever such evils are caused by us to any person, they originate in great anger, violent jealousy, or a desire for revenge. God is therefore called, because of these acts, jealous, revengeful, wrathful, and keeping anger, all of which can be found in Nahum here. That is to say, he performs acts similar to those which, when performed by us, originate in certain psychical dispositions, in jealousy, desire for retaliation, revenge, or anger. They are in accordance with the guilt of those who are to be punished, and not the result of any emotion, for he is above all defect. All right, let me make sure that you can understand this, because we oftentimes have an easier path to understand, or a lower threshold for our desire to understand, when good things are taking place. When we are being blessed, when we are experiencing merciful compassion, when we are being given gracious bounty, we tend not to ask questions, because, it's good. And as the common idiom goes, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. When things are going bad, on the other hand, we often sit up and take much greater notice. It's psychology known as the negativity bias. As such, we often will hear people complain about God acting as a vengeful God, an angry God, a wrathful God, etc., and treat this as though it is a serious defect. Well, as Rambam is pointing out, it is not a mental or emotional state that God is in when these things take place. Yes, for humans, we are in various emotional states when we behave in ways that are called jealous, revengeful, wrathful, etc. But God doesn't have emotions. So instead, we are merely labeling those catastrophes with the terminology that mirrors human behavior. And, as it goes on to say, the same is the case with all divine acts. Though resembling those acts which emanate from our passions and psychical dispositions, they are not due to anything superadded to his essence. Right? God and humans are fundamentally different, even if we tend to use very similar or even identical language between the two. When it says King David is angry, or King Saul, who was known for his anger much more, that is because Saul is under the influence of that particular emotion at that moment, and that explains his behavior. When it says God is angry, we should not think that God has an emotional state of anger at that moment. Instead, we should simply think that, the action that is taking place resembles the actions that take place when human beings are angry. However, God is not doing this out of anger, but is doing it because it is the correct action under this particular set of circumstances for God to take. Now, why is that distinction so important? Well, Rambam hopefully will make this clear. The governor of a country, if he is a prophet, should conform to these attributes. Acts must be performed by him moderately and in accordance with justice, not merely as an outlet of his passion. So, unfortunately, many people could read the language of the Torah as thinking when you're in charge, you get to act on all your emotions. Be angry, be jealous, be vengeful. That's what God is. And Rambam wants to make sure we understand that's not the case. Instead, he must not lose his anger nor allow his passion to overcome him. For all passions are bad, and they must be guarded against as far as it lies in man's power. When he says all passions are bad, he doesn't mean that all emotion is bad. He means all strong emotion that causes us to behave in ways that are not within the bounds of harmony of good behavior, such as anger and wrath. Those passions are not good, and we have to be constantly on the watch that they are not controlling our behavior. At times, and towards some persons, he must be merciful and gracious, not only from motives of mercy and compassion, but according to their merits. At other times, and towards other persons, he must evince anger, revenge, and wrath in proportion to their guilt, but not from motives of passion. He must be able to condemn a person to death by fire without anger, passion, or loathing against him, and must exclusively be guided by what he perceives of the guilt of the person and by a sense of the great benefit which a large number will derive from such a sentence. All right, so it's hard for us to wrap our head around this, but let me see if I can't continue to explain what Rambam is going for here. When we are in a position to make decisions, especially if we are in a position of power, sometimes we will have to act in ways that would be described as merciful and compassionate. And that's fine, but we should only be acting with mercy and compassion if that is, in fact, the correct action at that time. We may want to be merciful, but if justice tells me not to be, that indeed this person is guilty of this crime and they deserve this punishment, then I cannot allow my feeling of mercy to supersede the justice that must be meted out. Likewise, there may be other times when my own feelings of anger or revenge want me to behave very harshly against a person, but I must make sure that my decision is only being driven by justice, not by the emotion of anger and revenge. And even when my emotion and the justice line up, let's say the worst of the worst person that needs to be executed, I must make sure that as their execution is carried out, I am not experiencing the anger or feelings of revenge that we might call natural, because to do so would be to feed them. And the more we feed those emotions, the stronger they get in controlling our behavior outside of when it would be appropriate. That is to say, we can act vengefully even when those actions that we might call vengeful are not the appropriate action at that time. So, as he points out, because this can be a difficult concept in particular, you have no doubt noticed in the Torah how the commandment to annihilate the 7 nations and to save alive nothing that breathes is followed immediately by the words that they teach you not to do after all their abominations, which they have done unto their gods. So should you sin against the Lord your God. That is to say, you shall not think that this commandment implies an act of cruelty or retaliation. The nations of Canaan that we were ordered to drive out or to fight until the end if they refused, we should not think that this is permission to be cruel or that we are doing this out of some sense of vengeance or anger. Instead, it is an act demanded by the tendency of man to remove everything that might turn him away from the right path and to clear away all obstacles in the road to perfection. that is, to the knowledge of God. At that particular point in our history, it was necessary that the Canaanites be removed completely, or else we would have completely succumbed to their idolatry, and Torah and our people would have been lost. Thus, we had to act very strongly in those wars of the time of Joshua and Judges. That doesn't mean that it was meant to create cruelty or to reward cruelty or to celebrate cruelty or anger or any other of those emotions. It was simply something that had to be done at that particular moment. Nevertheless, acts of mercy, pardon, pity, grace should more frequently be performed by the governor of a country than acts of punishment, seeing that all the 13 midot of God's are attributes of mercy with only one exception, namely, visiting the iniquity of fathers upon their children. For the meaning of the preceding attribute is, and he will not utterly destroy. So Rambam wants to make sure that when we are making these decisions about how we should behave, we should recognize that on average, and far more than average, we should be acting with mercy, pardon, pity, and grace, as after all, 12 of the 13 midot that we list are ones where we are acting with kindness, or that is to say, God is acting with kindness. So if God has deliberately stacked the list of midot that Moses was looking to experience with midot, with characteristics of kindness, that's not coincidental. There is only one, the visiting of iniquity, the punishment of children for the sins of the father, which we'll talk about in just a second, that actually talks about punishment. The rest are all about forgiveness. So clearly that is the predilection. That is the direction that we should lean when making these decisions. Now, with regards to that iniquity question, when it is said that God is visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, this refers exclusively to the sin of idolatry and to no other sin. That this is the case may be inferred from what is said in the Ten Commandments, upon the third and fourth generation of my enemies, none except idolaters being called enemy, as you can see from Deuteronomy, and every abomination to the Lord which he hates, which is talking about idolatry. So the third and fourth iniquities only go towards enemies, and enemies are only defined as those who are idolaters, and therefore that is the narrow application of this one element of punishment found within the 13 midot. It was, however, considered sufficient to extend the punishment to the fourth generation rather than making it infinite, because the fourth generation is the utmost a man can see of his posterity, and when therefore the idolaters of a place are destroyed, the old man worshipping idols is killed, his son, his grandson, and his great-grandson, that is the fourth generation, meaning that will tear out idolatry from root to stalk, that the entirety of it would be removed, and that would keep idolatry from continuing to fester and cause all of the other horrific problems that idolatry causes wherever it begins to get purchased and grow in the ground. Now, back to the general concept that hopefully we're getting a handle on. We have shown why it has been considered sufficient to mention only these 13 out of all of his acts, namely because they are required for the good government of a country, where the chief aim of man should be to make himself as far as possible similar to God. That is to say, to make his acts similar to the acts of God, or as our sages expressed it in explaining the verse, "You shall be holy," which is an echo of our verse here. He is gracious, so be you also gracious. He is merciful, so be you also merciful. That it is not about imitating God in being, divinely powerful and, shooting lightning bolts out of fingertips, as you see in other mythologies and fiction, but instead, we imitate God by imitating these 13 attributes of graciousness, of forgiveness, of merciful, of kindness, of goodness. That is where we imitate. We see examples of that throughout this chapter and throughout the Torah. of how we imitate God in that way, of that being our benchmark of what holiness is. The principal object of this chapter, meaning a guide for the perplexed, was to show that all attributes ascribed to God are attributes of his acts and do not imply that God has inequalities, meaning God is not divisible by the various adjectives that we use to describe God. They are simply often helpful labels, but should not be read as literal descriptors of some aspect of God, for that concept will inevitably lead towards division, of dividing God into pieces, of having concept of God shifting and changing at different times, all of which implies imperfection, and more dangerously implies the division of God in our mind into sub-deities, which leads, of course, to idolatry, which, as we've seen, is a very big problem. All right, we will leave it there for today. I know that was an awful lot to try and take in. Like I said, I don't dive into Moreh Nevuchim very often, but as I hear many people use terms about God that they seem to feel it's okay to describe God in this way, I felt it necessary with, of course, the wonderful serendipity of this particular Torah portion to try and bring some of the insight that Rambam has brought to us for more than 1,000 years, that indeed God is perfect and indivisible into different attributes and elements, that the attributes that we describe of God are actually describing his actions, and they are done so that we can generate those attributes within ourselves so that we will behave in a way that will yield similar holy results in this world. We will leave it there for today. I hope everybody is well. And for those of you that are in town, I hope you'll join me tonight for the new class beginning on tefillah, on prayer. Take care and be well. And yes, I will be loading those up to YouTube afterwards, but there will not be as much interaction with the live stream. So I apologize for those that can't make it in person.